you just rehired an experienced assessor in the end and managed to get that one going. How did you, when did you revisit that sort of strategy again?
It was at the very start of when standards first started getting talked about. So when the government think tanks were talking about this new qualification and they were basing it on sort of technical expertise over that sort of tick box qualification pathway, at the very, very start of that, we were involved quite early at the company I was working in. We had sort of, different groups set up to have a look at it, how it would affect the business, and they were quite forward thinking in their approach to it. They embraced it early doors, really. So quite early on in that process, I was in a position where I was sort of the head of education in that role. So I had the influence to be able to do it as well, which was good. I didn't have to convince the senior team. I was the senior person. So I said, well, I really think we should look at a blended approach to this. I think we should retrain our existing people and have a look at what we need to do with them. But I think we should take on a set of people that are working in industry now. So we looked across 3 qualifications, which were administration, dental nursing and engineering at the time. And I said, right, this is what we're going to do. Let's talk to people in industry. Let's see where we go with it. Let's speak to people, see if they want to come into this sort of field, explain what we do and see where it goes from there.
So the second time, it was more of a blanket approach and you got more than one person on at the time. So how did you go about engaging people outside of the sector to consider a career change?
The engineering was probably the easiest, so I'll use that example because with the engineering field, most engineers want to be able to give something back to the next generation coming through. So the company I was working at run a Saturday club where school kids could come, learn what engineering was about on a Saturday morning, and then decide if they wanted to take that up as a career longer down the line as an apprenticeship. So one of the tutors there was an ex-engineer who'd literally just come out of industry, who was about to retire. And I said, well, have you ever done this kind of thing before? And he'd never done it under formal qualifications. He'd just done it as a general taster. This is engineering. So we took him and we said, well, this is what we're looking to do with you. So he was a perfect candidate in terms of the engineering, and it worked extremely well because he had the credibility, he understood the industry, he was current in his knowledge. He was used to dealing with sort of younger people coming through apprenticeships and sort of the younger elements. So he was able to give that experience properly. And because he'd been on he didn't have any qualifications in terms of training in delivery or classrooms or anything like that. He was just literally an industry person that came on a Saturday morning to give talks to the kids. So it worked because I think he'd done the Saturday mornings and the team sort of wrapped themselves around him in terms of that support for him on the qualification side. He was willing to learn, retrain, get his qualifications and do all of that. So that was great.
And so I know, when the standards came out, strictly speaking, they don't need that assessor qualification anymore. So I can imagine that had a bit of a sway in that decision as well. But how did you still satisfy that teaching and learning sort of objective from an Ofsted point of view to make sure that they, yes, they've got the occupation experience, but how are they still going through those proverbial tick boxes?
This is where I have a frustration because I think with certain qualifications, I think you can really clearly demonstrate that industry experience as an advantage over your previous qualifications and how you've previously delivered stuff. I think the disadvantages to me is that if you've got somebody who's a qualified assessor, they can be absolutely fantastic. But if you're trying to deliver a standard which is all about current expertise, current knowledge in that field, and they haven't done it for 10, 15 years, it's extremely difficult for them to be able to do that. So I think when we looked at the standard side to develop that, the qualifications are really still quite linear, and still to this day, some of the qualifications are literally the old frameworks slightly revamped and tweaked a little bit to throw in a bit of extra additional teaching and learning and industry expertise. So I think the Ofsted is a big problem, and it's still a big problem because I still speak to people in the industry now about trying to demonstrate why you're doing what you're doing. And why is this person delivering his qualification? They still want, and one of the first questions I'll ask you at the initial Ofsted meeting is, give me a list of the qualifications of your trainers and assessors. And it frustrates the hell out of me because why? Why is the first question, how qualified is that person to deliver? Why is the first question not, how far are these learners progressing? What do they know about the industry that they're going to be working in? That would be my first question as an Ofsted inspector, not how qualified the person is that's delivering it, because I think it's in this day and age, I think it's quite a naive approach. I mean, we've spoke before about digital technologies and the future of qualifications and where they're going to go in the future. So if you don't start looking at people in industry retraining and becoming trainers and assessors, you're just going to run out of people because there's going to be nobody left. They'll have all retired. Nobody's retraining in these qualifications and these assessors pathways. It's not a career option that people look at. It's more one they fall into. But I think if you consciously look at who is the best person to deliver that qualification to those people, who are they going to learn the most from? I personally think, and this is a controversial view, and I'll probably get hammered for this, but I don't think it's your trainer assessor with that qualification if they've not been in industry for 10, 15 years.
So, I mean, we'll circle back to this one. I just want to go back a couple of steps. So when you've got, you've got one side of the coin where you're getting somebody from their occupational market and you're training them up. That's pretty straightforward. It's not straightforward, but you get the gist. You put them on a qualification, you retrain them. Might take a month, might take a year, but at the end of the day, they will be retrained. Mm-hmm. Where you've got, let's say, that trainer assessor or that skills coach role now, but they've been in this market 5 or 10 years plus, and we've all read the various standards. Everybody wants recent occupational competence. Let's not get into what recent means. It could be in a year, it could be 10 years. But how do you satisfy that? So how do you keep your training and your trainers, assessors, or your skills coaches up to speed on the modern, whether it's a modern technology or what the current, the modern day workforce looks like, whether that's admin, engineering, or I don't know, cybersecurity?
So what we actually approach at my last role is to try and get the assessors back into industry. So we set up a model pre-COVID of them going back into industry 1 day a month.
Yeah.
To essentially retrain what the job's about now. So we trialed it in care first because it was one of the easiest to do, to be fair, because you could go back in quite easily, spend the day there, and a lot of them were already sort of potentially involved in little bits of support with other people that were working in care. They knew people in care homes from previous, lives and previous careers and stuff. So it was the easiest one to trial, really, and that worked really well. And I think it was really eye-opening to a few of them because they were teaching this qualification in a way that they'd been taught and the way that they understood. But when they went out, they saw that the industry had changed from a technology aspect, one of them, in terms of, the data that's used to record the people in care homes, the level of involvement in reporting that you have to do, and how much evidence and documentation you have to fill out for each, patient and each person that's under care. All of those things weren't there when they were in care. So they'd missed a huge aspect for me of the qualification. They weren't really given a true picture of what it's like to work in the care industry. They were basing it on their experience 10 years ago, where it was all not nice and fluffy. It's a really extremely hard career, but it was all about spending time with that person. It wasn't about the paperwork. It wasn't about the writing reports and the medicines that you're administrating and the evidence that you have to produce and, all the different reports you have to do for the care companies and the reports that come out, the auditors that come out. There's a huge emphasis on documentation and evidencing that there never used to be in care.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's, is it, either side of this, is that costly? Is it costly to put them back into sector, and is it costly to then train, new starters into the market?
Yeah, it is. It's an investment in time as well as cost. So when going back into industry is time. So you're giving that person a day a month to go back into industry where I know, and it sounds very easy to do, it's not. I've worked in this sector for a long time. You're under pressure for overdue frameworks and learners that have cancelled reviews that you've had to book back into any spare time you've got. And so, I don't underestimate. It's a ridiculously hard job to be in education and training, particularly in the current climate, in any time, but particularly under the global pandemic that we're working under now. It's extremely difficult. But I think you've got to, as a senior team and as a senior member of that team, you've got to step back and say, right, at the heart of this is that learner. In 20 years' time, my legacy is that person that's gone into that job and how well they were trained by me. And I would want, as a manager, as a trainer, as anybody involved in education, I want them to look back in 10 years and say, I was really trained well by somebody who knew exactly what they were talking about. And I was fully prepared for this career. And I've been able to use that and take that knowledge myself and develop myself better because of that person.
Perfect. And so when you trialed, a few years ago, when you started bringing a few more people, outside, in the occupational experience into this market, what was the impact of that in both, whether that's the quality of learning across the team or just even from the social side within the team? Did it work well? Was it like throwing a bull into a china shop? What was it like?
Yeah, it was extremely difficult. It ruffled quite a few feathers, to be perfectly honest with you, because people in education training, quite rightly so, wear it as a badge of honour in terms of the qualification they've earned. They've earned them well. They've worked hard to get those qualifications and get where they are and utilise those qualifications. So I'm not trying to undervalue what they do. It was ridiculously difficult in terms of trying to get the existing educators, I'll call them, is the best term I can come up with, to try and take that person and make them part of the team. They were always undervalued. They were always sort of looked down at, almost. You're not an education person. You're not a trainer. You're not a deliverer. You know, whatever terms people use. You're not one of us, basically. And it was extremely difficult to get that person integrated. And it was the best way I found. It was never an exact science. There was always tension. I'm not saying I solved this problem, but the best way I managed to get around it was with learner surveys. So I used to survey the learners quite heavily and say, how's your experience? How's everything been? And I used to push those back into team meetings. So I'd say, look, this is what the learners are saying. You've got your opinion, I get it. You know, you don't think that person can do that because they're not from industry or they've not had a certain qualification or they've not come up the same route you have. But the learners are loving it. The learners are enjoying it. They're getting something out of it. And that's the true test at the end of the day. So your credibility, they have to work a lot harder to get that credibility. Certainly a lot harder.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we all lose sight in this market, don't we, at the time? I know we all talk about it, but it is the learners at the end of the day. It's you know, whatever level you're working at, whether it's your trainees, your apprenticeships, your adult skills, it's about the learners and the impact that these courses are having on them. Did you find, you know, any general struggles or challenges with the new starters outside of education? Was there things that you learned where you had to get them to, I don't know, maybe buddy up with some of the existing educators to get them up to speed? How did that?
Yeah, no, very much so. It was, I was lucky in the respect of most of the teams I've introduced these people into. They were good teams on the whole. There wasn't many saboteurs amongst them. They were mostly good people who wanted everybody to succeed. So it was very much that. It's exactly what you said. It's about budding those people up together and sharing that knowledge. I think where the people that don't have the qualifications do struggle immensely is that they're not used to that structure and that order and that pace of delivery and how they need to deliver that topic. They sometimes come at it and try and deliver everything all at once. Instead of that structured approach, that's where your assessor and your qualifications do really help. You know, there is massive positives to that because you're used to delivering things in bite-sized chunks in a certain order. You're used to judging when that learner needs that piece of information, when they don't need that information. You know, they're highly skilled people who work in education and training. I'm not trying to devalue it at all in any way, shape or form. So that's where they do struggle, is delivering things in the right order, in the right structure. They're not necessarily looking at that qualification thinking, right, this is point A, this is where I need to get to, right, I'm going to deliver it in this order. The thinking is a bit different when you've not worked in that industry. It's like, oh, I know something about that, so I'll jump to that bit over there. Or I've done that previously in a career, so I'll jump to that bit over there. And you can't always do that because the qualification doesn't always lend itself to you to do that. I think the other area that I massively underestimated was the employers. I did get a lot of flack off employers.
Really?
Putting these people out and spending time with the learners. They were like, you've sent me an unqualified person, was a comment I got more than once back from employers. And they weren't happy. Oh, this person's not qualified. You've just sent me somebody that's not able to deliver my learning. And I did get quite a lot of flack off employers. So that we did have to battle that quite often.
Wow. So, you know, going back to the point you made earlier, but now sort of pushing the conversation forward. You know, we are where we are today. And like you said, there is going to be a skills shortage. Yeah. You know, in some niches within this market more than others. You know, we know that one of the barriers to entry to this market is the difference in salary. You know, the salary. You know, a lot of the salaries, the education salaries, don't match those of the occupational markets. How do we satisfy that going forward? How do we bring that closer together? I mean, obviously the easy answer is narrowing that gap. As difficult as or easy as that might be with lowering funding bandings and everything else that goes with it, and the clawbacks and everything that the ESFA and Ofsted impose on training providers and colleges. But what are the solutions do you think there are to this?
I think there's got to be a conscious effort from everybody involved in terms of, right, what are we trying to achieve from this? I think the qualification bodies need to have a serious look at the qualifications and say, right, if we are going to make this really about vocational education, let's make it about vocational education. Let's, remove things like 20% off the job requirements and things like that. It's, let's make it really about that person working in an industry and developing the skills they need to work in that industry, and not. There is still, to this day, however much they take qualifications out of it, and most training providers, and I've been there, it's easier to throw the qualification back in, even if there's not one there. You still throw the qualification back in because it gives you that structure and order to work to. But until there's a real conscious effort from all of the bodies, the SFA, Ofsted, everybody, to come together and say, right, hang on a minute, this is the learner doing this job, this is how they need to do it, and we're going to just let them get on and do it in the employer, and we're going to jump in as and when we need it. We'll not set certain requirements, right? Every 12 weeks we've got to do this, or every 8 weeks we've got to do that. The learner might not need that. There might be a learner that's absolutely fine for 3 or 4 months on their own, learning at their own pace, developing those skills. We've set them the task. There might be other learners it needs to do every week. There isn't the flexibility to do that at the moment within the qualifications, and that's a frustration. But I think we need to address that in terms of the qualifications, definitely.
Oh, we lost you there for a second.
What's wrong with you got that? But it was about the qualifications for me. I think there needs to be that real conscious effort to strip out a lot of the stuff that's in that qualification in terms of the administrative elements of the qualification and make it about vocational learning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, sort of one final question for you then, John. What sectors do you think are going to really suffer from this if we don't make a change over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
Technology sectors, definitely. I think it's every sector, to be honest with you. I think it's every sector needs to benefit from somebody who knows what they're talking about. And I don't mean that disrespectfully to people in education and training, but I think industry is moving so fast. And in the last 12 months, if you look at the last 12 months for a global pandemic, every industry has fundamentally shifted the way it delivers its operation. Whichever industry you're in, it's had to change the way it does things. So an educator won't necessarily know that, but the people working in the industry have lived and breathed that. So we need to tap into that knowledge. I think there's 2 ways you can do this, and I've always been a believer in this, but I've never managed to pull it off, is looking at a program where you take people who are about to retire in industry and put them back into education and training. Because I think there's a wealth of knowledge there that we're not utilizing. We're letting people go off and retire that probably want to give something back, that have got really up-to-date recent knowledge. And I think there's a whole program there, even if that bridges the gap for a year or 2 years while a younger element of that comes through and can learn from that element. I think there's an opportunity there to work with a certain section of the community that are about to retire in industry that want to give something back. So I think that's one option. And I think the other side of it is we've got to start looking at pay rates in education. We've got to value education more. And I've sat there looking at budgets and balance sheets and trying to balance the books, because we don't get paid half as much as anyone thinks we do in education and training. You don't, by the time you've put the materials in, put the training in and got the person in, there's very little margin in education and training. People think we make fortunes in education and we don't. It's ridiculous the level of margin we make compared to some industries. But we've got to look at what we're going to do with that. So there's got to be an investment. There's got to be a conscious effort from training companies to say, look, we're going to invest in this for the right ways. It's about the education of that person. We might not make as much money, but longer term we'll produce better quality people, which will get the return on investment because we'll gain business off that. We'll gain more market share. We'll gain more contracts. But it's a brave move to do that as a training provider. So I've been there. So.
No, I can imagine. Well, John, I really appreciate your time. So just before we finish off there, if somebody's listening to this and they're hiring for their team and they want to try and implement something, they want, maybe they're stepping into it for the first time and they just want to get your thoughts on it. Are you happy for them to be reaching out to you to pick your brains on it?
Yeah, no problem at all. Helping somebody, I'll talk you through the bad things, the pitfalls, and the good things. So no problem at all.
Brilliant. Well, look, John, thanks very much for your time. I'll catch up with you soon.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Adam.